Why would a father stare into his own son's eyes and call him a serpent? And why would heaven itself, in the final pages of Scripture, blot that son's name out forever? This isn't a legend or an allegory. It's about a real person, a real tribe, and a divine sentence that runs from the first book of Genesis straight through to Revelation. His name was Dan, son of Jacob, once chosen to bring justice to his people, but at some point something changed. He became different, secretive, dangerous, a sign of deception, a warning that still speaks to the church today. In this video, you'll uncover the ancient prophecy spoken over Dan at his birth, the spiritual compromise that tainted a nation, and the stunning mystery in Revelation that rarely gets mentioned from any pulpit. Don't stop at the intro. Watch this story until the final moment, because what happened to Dan might already be repeating in our time, and by the end, you'll see why God seals some names forever, and others He removes. Before we begin, say it out loud or drop it in the comments. I will not be erased. I choose truth, not deception. Type it now. Let that be the banner flying over your name, because what you're about to witness proves this. Some were born into the promise, but disappeared because they wouldn't stay loyal. Ready? Let's begin. Genesis 30, 1-6, Rachel's cry and the birth of Dan. This story doesn't open with happiness. It starts with envy, bitterness, and a silent war between two sisters. Rachel, the wife Jacob loved most, couldn't have children. Leah, her sister and rival, had already given Jacob many sons, while Rachel's womb remained closed. In her sorrow she cried out, "Give me children, or I die." Genesis 30. But instead of waiting on God, Rachel reached for a human fix. She gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob, not out of love, but as a weapon of competition. When Bilhah bore a son, Rachel named him Dan, saying, "God has judged me and has heard my voice." Genesis 30:6. At first glance it sounds spiritual, but listen closer. She didn't say, "God blessed me." She didn't say, "God favored me." She said, "God judged me." The name Dan means He judged. This wasn't a birth rooted in joy. It was a child named by verdict, not by love, but by rivalry. While Jacob's other sons were named from joy or covenant, Dan's name came from a place of inner trial, a heart battling rejection, shame, and competition. Some destinies don't begin with celebration. They begin with scars, and that changes everything. In Hebrew thought, a name wasn't just a label. It was a declaration, a glimpse into someone's future. Dan, from the moment he took his first breath, bore the weight of judgment. Not a sentence he earned, but one he inherited. His mother felt judged, her soul was weary, her spirit wounded, and the name she gave her son held all that pain. So now we must ask, was God judging Rachel for her desperation, or was He already watching the son she birthed through manipulation? Because pain at the start often forms patterns that echo through generations. Here's your reflection. Are our beginnings already blueprints? And if so, what does Dan's origin really say about where he was headed? If this part shifted how you think about spiritual calling, type in the comments, "It started at birth." In the ancient Hebrew world, names were never random. They weren't chosen for style or sound or family tradition. They were chosen with purpose, because they carried weight. A name was a prophetic imprint, a whisper from the future, sealed into one word. So when Rachel declared, "God has judged me and given me a son," she wasn't just voicing her pain. She was declaring a sentence into her child's spirit. She called him Dan, meaning He judged. Now, pause here. Every other son of Jacob was named in blessing, in covenant, or in hope. Judah was praised, Joseph was added, Levi was joined, but Dan was judged. He is the only son of Jacob, whose birth is tied not to promise, but to a personal crisis. The name doesn't point to joy. It points to a spiritual lawsuit. God hath judged me, Rachel says. But was God judging her, or was he judging the decision she made to substitute trust with manipulation, to bypass divine timing by offering her maid to her husband? And now we must ask a harder question. Was Dan born to fulfill destiny or to fulfill a dispute? From the very beginning, his story smells like a courtroom. The gavel is already in the air, and heaven, quietly, is already watching him. You see, when people are born out of dysfunction, their lineage often carries echoes of that spiritual breach. And for Dan, it seems he was born under surveillance, not celebration, not just by men, but by God himself. The name Dan set the tone. The moment he arrived, heaven did not shout, "Blessed," it whispered, "watch him." Because sometimes a name is not a promise, sometimes it's a warning, and if names carry futures, then what future was Dan carrying? If this part revealed something new to you, drop in the comments. Names are prophecies. I want to see who's catching this. Genesis 49:16, 18. The serpent by the way. The room is still. Jacob, now aged and nearing his final breath, calls his 12 sons one by one, not to give wealth, but to reveal what shall befall them in the last days. This is no ordinary farewell. It is prophetic discharge. One by one, destinies are spoken. Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Then Judah, called a lion. The scepter shall not depart from him. Royal, powerful, majestic. But then comes Dan. And what Jacob says doesn't feel like a blessing. It feels like a warning cloaked in prophecy. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Genesis 49:16. So far, it sounds hopeful, just, strong, but the very next breath. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path, that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. Genesis 49:17. Wait, a serpent? That's not noble. That's not protective. That's not the language of leadership or legacy. It's the same symbol used in Genesis 3, the serpent who crept into Eden, the one who whispered to Eve, the one who disrupted the plan from within. Why would Jacob choose imagery tied to Satan when describing his own son? While Judah is called a lion, Dan is compared to a serpent. Judah stands boldly at the front. Dan strikes silently from behind. Judah reflects royal power, but Dan becomes a symbol of sabotage. The serpent doesn't fight face to face. It hides. It waits. It watches for moments of weakness, then strikes, and Jacob's words weren't just reflections on character. He was seeing beyond the natural. He was witnessing something in the spirit realm. Because right after speaking about Dan, Jacob breaks into a sudden cry, saying, "I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord." Genesis 49:18. Why would he cry out there, only there? He didn't do this after describing Levi or Simeon, or even Reuben, whose sins were great. Only after Dan. It's as if the vision took a dark turn, so disturbing that Jacob had to call for God's deliverance mid-prophecy. So the deeper question is this: was Jacob glimpsing something demonic ahead in Dan's lineage? A spirit like the Antichrist? A hidden serpent operating within the house of God? Because among all his sons, Dan alone is not likened to a creature of power, not a lion, not a wolf, not even a horse. Dan is described as a serpent along the path. And what do serpents do? They don't charge forward. They slither through systems, crawl into camps, enter sanctuaries. They twist sacred truth. They imitate holiness. Dan, it seems, would become a future danger not from outsiders, but from deep inside the covenant itself. This changes everything. Because not every threat shouts. Not every enemy breaks in through the gates. Some are born inside the walls of the promise. Judges 18, the corruption begins. Dan was originally chosen to judge Israel, But what happens when the one called to bring justice becomes the one spreading confusion? In Judges 18, the tribe of Dan hits a breaking point. They failed to take the land God had given them, and instead of fighting in faith, they chose the path of least resistance. They abandoned their inheritance and went searching north for easier territory. On their journey, they stumbled upon something that would stain their legacy forever. A man named Micah had built his own little sanctuary. It housed carved idols, household gods, and, strangely, a Levite priest who served as Micah's personal holy man. Dan's spies saw this strange setup, and instead of rejecting it, they admired it. And what did they do next? They took it all: the idols, the priest, everything. Then they told the Levite, "Come with us. Be a father and a priest to our tribe. Why serve one man when you can serve a whole people?" Judges 18:19. And just like that, the first counterfeit religious institution was born in Israel. It wasn't led by pagans. It wasn't forced by outsiders. It was built by a tribe of Jacob. This wasn't simple rebellion. It was replication. Dan didn't deny God. They remade him. They created their own version, and now Israel had two altars, one in Jerusalem, established by God, and one in Dan, born from ambition. The serpent had struck, not by attacking from the outside, but by poisoning the inside, and that's what made it so deadly. This wasn't open betrayal. It didn't wear the mask of blasphemy. It looked like worship. This is Black Faith Tales. They even had a priest dressed in an ephod. But God wasn't in it. What Dan set in motion became a spiritual confusion that echoed for generations. They became the root of religious betrayal, the blueprint for what fake worship would later look like among God's own people. It didn't begin with the golden calves in Samaria. It began with a quiet theft, a borrowed priest, and a man-made altar. And here's a truth that makes many uncomfortable. Not every betrayal makes noise. Some are calculated. Some wear priestly garments while silently pushing out God's presence. Dan was supposed to bring justice. Instead, they opened the door to deception. If you've stayed with this message so far, type this in the comments: "I choose the altar of truth." Now we arrive at one of the most sobering scenes in the Bible, Revelation 7, where 144,000 are sealed by heaven. Each tribe is named, each person marked: 12,000 from Judah, 12,000 from Reuben, from Gad, Asher, Naphtali. But suddenly, something's wrong. Someone's missing. Dan is gone. This isn't a printing error. It's not some ancient oversight. It's deliberate. Dan, the fifth son of Jacob, once called to judge, is not included in the list of the sealed. And in his place? A name most people skip over: Manasseh, Joseph's son. That silence isn't poetic, it's judicial. Dan wasn't forgotten. Dan was removed. This wasn't a blank space. It was a verdict. God said nothing, and that said everything. Because divine silence is often a form of divine judgment. Let that settle in. Among all the tribes that stumbled, Judah, who committed incest, Reuben, who violated his father's bed, God still found a remnant to redeem. He still sealed their names. But with Dan, nothing remained to rescue. Why? Because Dan didn't simply fall. He built a doctrine out of his downfall. Dan didn't just rebel. He branded rebellion as righteousness. This is Black Faith Tales. But an inheritance without faithfulness holds no value when the end comes. You can be born inside the promise and still miss the seal. Names are not just sounds. They carry meaning. Dan wasn't just a name, it was a sentence. A child brought forth through rivalry, not through covenant. That name set the tone for his tribe's future. This moment calls us to reflect on the words we've spoken, over ourselves and others. What you've been called, what your family labeled you, might be carrying weight you've never questioned. Religion without truth becomes dangerous. Dan's downfall wasn't open rebellion. It was religious imitation. He built a system that looked sacred, but slowly pulled Israel away from God. The most lethal doctrine isn't the one that screams heresy. It's the one that whispers holiness while removing the Spirit. Betrayal doesn't always start with thunder. Sometimes it begins in quiet, calculated steps. Dan didn't rise with violence. He rose with manipulation, with stolen relics, a self-made priest, and a fabricated altar. Not all betrayals come crashing in. Some slip through in silence. And heaven doesn't just look at your bloodline. In Revelation 7, Dan isn't missing because God overlooked him, but because he no longer reflected God's likeness. You can trace your heritage back to the patriarchs and still be left off heaven's roll. God deals with apostasy more directly than open sin. Other tribes sinned deeply, but they left behind a faithful remnant. Dan left nothing but idolatry, and that idolatry became their name. This is a clear warning. It's better to fall and turn back than to perform holiness while truth is absent. What we start in our homes echoes through our legacy. Rachel's cry, Bilhah's birth, Jacob's words, all became prophecy for an entire tribe. The choices you make today are not yours alone. They ripple through generations. Dan was supposed to deliver justice, but ended up being judged. His life leaves us with one haunting question. Will your name be sealed at the end, or silently erased like Dan's? This is not just ancient memory. It's reflection. Dan's story opened with a name that meant judge, but in the end, the judge became the condemned. His name appears in the scroll of Genesis, but is missing when the Lamb opens the seals in Revelation. And that question now stretches beyond his life into yours. When heaven gathers its faithful, will your name be spoken, or will silence declare your verdict? Dan's warning is clear. Titles don't rescue us. Being born into covenant isn't the same as remaining true to it. Wearing the name of God's people doesn't guarantee God's seal. So now comes the turning point. Will you be sealed or erased? If this story stirred your spirit, if you felt the voice of God calling through this message, hit subscribe right now, not just to this channel, but to the deeper call of truth and repentance. And if someone in your life still thinks religion means righteousness, send this to them today. Don't keep this truth buried. Turn this video into a spiritual weapon. And if your eyes were opened, you haven't seen anything yet. Go to the next video and keep digging. And finally, if you've made the decision to walk in truth, no matter what, type it in the comments. I will not be erased. This wasn't just Dan's story. It was ours. And now we write the ending. Let it be better than his. Thank you for watching. God bless you. This is Black Faith Tales.